right. There it is. Okay. On Sunday, April 8th, 1945, a group of political prisoners who had recently arrived at the German prison camp in Schönberg, Germany, asked a young clergyman, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if he would conduct a service for his fellow prisoners at the camp. At first, Bonhoeffer was reluctant, but at the insistence of the prisoners, he relented and led the diverse group in what would be his last worship service. Bonhoeffer prayed. He read the verses for the day from the Lutheran prayer book, which was Isaiah 53:5 from the Old Testament and 1 Peter 1:3 from the New Testament. Isaiah 53 passage is one you're very familiar with. It says, "But he was wounded for our transgressions. He was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and by his stripes we are healed." Bonhoeffer took time to explain the verses, which must have had an even more poignant meaning, as many of these prisoners knew that they would soon be executed by the Nazi regime. A fellow prisoner, an Englishman who had survived the imprisonment, described what happened next. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. He, Bonhoeffer, hardly finished his last prayer when the doors opened and two evil-looking men in civilian clothes came in and said, "Prisoner Bonhoeffer, get ready to come with us." Those words, "come with us," for all prisoners had come to mean one thing, the scaffold. He bade us goodbye, and he drew me aside, and he said, "This is the end, but for me, the beginning of life." Dietrich Bonhoeffer's execution order came directly from Adolf Hitler. A few days before, Hitler had discovered the identities of several conspirators who had plotted to have him assassinated in an attempt to end his reign of terror over the German people. That evening, Bonhoeffer was transported to the German concentration camp at Flossenbürg. At daybreak the next morning, Monday, April 9th, 1945, Dietrich Bonhoeffer was executed by hanging. The Flossenbürg prison doctor who would prepare Bonhoeffer for his execution on the morning of the 9th would later write, through the half door in the room in the huts that I saw Pastor Bonhoeffer, before taking off his prison guard, kneeling on the floor, praying fervently to his God. I was most deeply moved by the way this lovable man prayed. So devout, so certain that God had heard his prayer. At the place of execution, he again said a short prayer, and then climbed the steps to the gallows, brave and composed. His death ensued within a few seconds. In almost 50 years that I have worked as a doctor, I have hardly ever seen a man die so entirely submissive to the will of God. The crematorium at Flossenbürg prison was not working. So Bonhoeffer and his fellow prisoners were thrown into a pile and burned to ashes. And that symbolically and fittingly, his final indignity was an act of solidarity with the over 7 million victims of Hitler and the Third Reich's reign of terror in Germany. So today, I want to introduce you to my theological hero and vicarious mentor. The title for our lecture today is Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Who is he, and why should you care? Well, that's my challenge today, is to introduce you to him and hopefully help you leave with a care of what he has to say to us. So I'm not sure where I first met Bonhoeffer, but I do know how I began to get to know him at a much deeper level. Several years ago, while searching for a textbook that best served one of the objectives in a course that I used to teach here at CSU every semester, it was called The Church's Ministry. And I came across this book, Bonhoeffer Speaks Today. It became a standard text for that class, and I had the privilege of introducing him to a generation of CSU students at the time. The subtitle for that text is Following Jesus at All Cost. That subtitle came from what is arguably Bonhoeffer's greatest contribution to the church, which is his book. Ladies and gentlemen, Kristen Miller. Thank you, Kristen. The subtitle comes from this book, The Cost of Discipleship. In the year 2000, Christianity Today would name Discipleship, or The Cost of Discipleship, the second most influential book of the 20th century, behind only C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. My goal today is to introduce you to this man and to begin to make a case that you should care. I believe he has much to offer us, obviously with my own fascination with him, but especially as we think about the theme of our series, Remember My Name. The world circumstances that Professor Higley presented yesterday set us up beautifully for today. From an educational and spiritual perspective, we're left with questions. We're left with the questions, are we, 75 years later, doing any better at responding to the injustices and evils of the world than Bonhoeffer lived in? So I want to address how we might evaluate that today. In order to do that, I'm going to give you a quick walk through the life of Bonhoeffer with a particular focus on an influential time period that he had here in the United States. And so, hope to address that issue, why should you care? Bonhoeffer and his twin sister Sabine were born on October 4th, February 1906 in Breslau, Germany. Dietrich and Sabine were the sixth and seventh children of 8 in their family. His father, Karl, was a psychiatrist, and he made his mark on the field of psychiatry of being a critic of one of his contemporaries, Sigmund Freud. His mother, Paula Bonhoeffer, was also a teacher, and she was the granddaughter of a well-known German theologian by the name of Karl von Haas. Like most Germans, the Bonhoeffer family were members of the German Lutheran Church, but they were not a particularly religious family. And as such, they were not faithful in their church attendance, only on the big days, Christmas, Easter, and so forth. Yet they were a close family. So when Dietrich's older brother Walter Bonhoeffer, the second of the Bonhoeffer children, was killed in action during the Great War, World War I, it was a devastating event to the family. And it left a profound impact on young Dietrich, who was 12 at the time. A few years later, at the age of 14, and to the objection of his family, Bonhoeffer announced that he wanted to formally study theology. The family thought this was a terrible waste of his gifted mind and his many other talents. But he remained true to his word, and by the time he was 21 years old, he had completed his bachelor's degree, his master's degree at the Protestant Faculty of Theology at the University of Tübingen, as well as he had completed his dissertation for a doctorate of theology at Berlin University, graduating summa cum laude in 1927. His doctoral thesis, Sanctora Communion, or Communion of the Saints, we would translate it, would later be called a theological miracle by none other than the eminent theologian Karl Barth, all before he was 21 years old. His dissertation would form the basis of one of his later works called Life Together. I highlight that here because, in my particular opinion, chapter 1 of that text is the most profound argument for the validity and the reason of fellowship and community in the church, and why it is so important to the Christian life experience. Upon graduation, Bonhoeffer spent the next few years in pastoral training for the Lutheran Church, which today we would call internship-like assignments in Germany and Spain. Interestingly, at each of those places, he was heavily involved in youth ministry. He seemed to be a magnet to young people, and he cared for them deeply, teaching confirmation classes to help bring them into the formal church. It was these experiences that nurtured his pastoral heart, which in his last years would become a sustaining and influential role in his life. In 1930, and it was a seminal year for Bonhoeffer's life, as he sailed to New York City, here in America, to begin a teaching fellowship at Union Theological Seminary. At Union, he would meet an African-American fellow seminarian. There were only 2 in the seminary at the time. His name was Franklin Fisher. Fisher introduced him to the Abyssinian Baptist Church in Harlem in the African American church experience. At Bonhoeffer quickly fell in love with that church, and his experiences at Abyssinian had a profound effect on Bonhoeffer's theological thinking. At Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer heard the words of well-known pastor Adam Clayton Powell preach the gospel in what he called, his words, rapturous ways. Powell introduced Bonhoeffer to a better understanding of the gospel, and especially to the social responsibility of the church to serve the underserved. At Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer forms a lifelong love for black gospel music, something he had never heard before. And so before he left New York a year later, he went to all the shops he could find in New York City and bought all the gospel recordings that he could to take back with him to Germany. He would later use them to teach and to serve and minister to the young seminarians he would teach at the seminary he'd become a part of. Bonhoeffer immersed himself in the life of the church, even serving as a Sunday school teacher for the while he was there. One Bonhoeffer scholar comments, at Abyssinian, Bonhoeffer's Christology changed. Maybe more accurately, it was formed. He writes, it changed to a form of Christ-centered Christianity that Bonhoeffer saw expressed with zeal at the church. Bonhoeffer himself writes about his experience there. He says, I heard the gospel preached in the black churches. Here, one really could still hear someone talk in a Christian sense about sin and grace and the love of God and ultimate hope, albeit in a form different to that which we are accustomed. He's writing to his German colleagues. In contrast to the often lecture style, and some of you will see the irony of that statement right now, in contrast to the often lecture-like character of the white Christ, the black Christ is preached with captivating passion and vividness. His year in America, especially his time at Abyssinian, changed Bonhoeffer. He returned to Germany in 1931 and became a lecturer in systematic theology at the University of Berlin. That same year, he received his ordination. In 1933, as Professor Higley reminded us yesterday, Hitler is installed as the Chancellor of Germany, and his influence is felt almost immediately. 2 days later, after Hitler's installation, Bonhoeffer was delivering a radio message, which he had previously prepared, attacking the concept of the false Führer. Führer is simply the German translation of the word leader. Hitler was called the Führer. In a sign of things to come, his address is cut off before he's finished. In April of 1933, the Aryan Civic Service legislation is passed, and it bans Jews from public employment. Shortly thereafter, Ludwig Müller is appointed Hitler's representative for the Protestant churches and is installed as the Reich Bishop of the first ever National Church of Germany. Hitler hijacked the church. A few months later, in early 1934, and in response to the Aryan Clause and to the Third Reich's takeover of the German National Church, Bonhoeffer, along with several other influential German pastors, formed the Confessing Church. It's a loose affiliation of churches, and it's formed around a document that later became known as the Barmen Declaration. Barmen was a sort of theological line in the sand that these theologians drew that day. And in it they write that Christ, not the Führer, is the head of the church. Robert Affine Brown offers this analysis of the Barmen thing. Let's go forward. There we go. Now you probably can't read it all, so I will read it to you. And that is the original script up there on the top as well. In 1934, the Barmen Declaration was a call to resistance against the theological claims of the Nazi state. Almost immediately after the Nazi seizure of power in 1933, Protestant Christians faced the pressure to Aryanize the church, expel Jewish Christians from the ordained ministry, and adopt Hitler's Führer principle as the organizing principle of church government. In essence, Hitler took over the church. In general, the churches succumbed to these pressures, and many German Christians embraced them willingly. The pro-Nazi German Christian movement became a force in the church. They glorified Hitler as a German prophet and preached that racial consciousness was a source of revelation among the Bible. Let me read that again. Racial consciousness is a source of revelation. What does that mean? It means our biases, our prejudice, our discrimination of people now became equal with the Word of God. But some Christians in Germany, including Lutheran, the Reformed, Independents, even some liberals and neo-Orthodox, opposed the encroachment of Nazi ideology on the church's proclamation. At Barmen, this emerging confessing church adopted a declaration which expressly repudiated the claim that other powers apart from Christ could be the sources of God's revelation. Now, there are 6 declarative theological statements in the Barmen Declaration. I'm not going to read them all here today, but by way of example, I present the opening section of the declaration. It reads, "In view of the errors of the German Christians and of the present Reich Church administration, which are ravaging the church and at the same time also shattering the unity of the German evangelical church, we confess the following evangelical truths. Number 1, quoting John 14:6, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." They offer an explanation in the next part of it. Here's their explanation. Jesus Christ, as he is attested to us in the Holy Scripture, is the one Word of God whom we have to hear, in whom we have to trust and obey in life and in death. That was it. They followed that then by the declaration, thus the name Barmen Declaration. Here's the declaration of that truth. We reject the false doctrine that the church could and should recognize as a source of its proclamation beyond and beside this one Word of God, yet other events, powers, historic figures, and truth as God's revelation. So they use that same formula, a biblical truth, a brief explanation of that truth, and then a resulting declarative statement of what that truth means to the true church of God. Thus, the Barmen Declaration and the formation of the confessing church set in motion an inevitable showdown with Hitler and the leaders of the Third Reich. The question now was for them, when and where and how would Hitler respond? Bonhoeffer, Barth, and the other church leaders knew that they were creating a document and a movement that put them squarely in the center of Hitler's crosshairs. In 1935, the next year, Bonhoeffer took a short pastoral stint in England, ministering to expats, German expats there. It lasted only a few months, and he was asked to return to Germany by the new confessing church to begin to start and to direct a new seminary for the church in the town of Finkenwald, Germany. Finkenwald. From the start, the seminarians were constantly harassed by the Gestapo. These pressures culminated in August 1937 when Himmler decreed that the education and examination of confessing minister candidates was now illegal. In September, the Gestapo closed Finkenwald, and in November, 27 of Bonhoeffer's former students were arrested. Bonhoeffer spent the next 2 years secretly traveling from one Eastern German village to another and into Poland to supervise and care for his students, most of whom were working illegally in small country parishes. But with the growing Gestapo surveillance, his activities became more limited. And all of this leads to a monumental decision by Bonhoeffer in 1938, at which time he decides to take a formal step to join the German resistance movement. He did not come to this lightly. As a matter of fact, he struggled with this decision. And because of this decision, he acknowledged to close confidants that he would disqualify himself from pastoral ministry that he had grown to love. It was no small thing. And it's noteworthy to mention that this is the same year that Hitler ordered all German citizens to take an oath of allegiance to him in recognition of his 50th birthday. Part of the celebration of that 50th birthday year, on November 9th, is a state-ordered and organized national riot and direct attack on the Jewish religion and people. It's called Kristallnacht, which literally means the night of broken glass. Nearly 3,000 synagogues across Germany are destroyed. 7,500 Jewish-owned shops are looted. And 3,000 Jewish men are arrested and sent to prison on that evening. Side note, not in the notes. There is only one place in Bonhoeffer's Bible where he ever put a note about anything. And it was related to a psalm that laments the plight of the Jewish people, and he dates it that day. Let me go backwards here. With growing pressure from friends to protect himself, in June of 1939, Bonhoeffer returns to the United States for a second time. But he immediately realized that this was a mistake, and he returns to Germany within days of his arrival in New York. And ironically, it was the last ship that the U.S. government would allow to cross the Atlantic Ocean because of the escalating hostilities in Europe. Upon his return to Germany, Bonhoeffer helps to organize the underground pastoral movement. In a few months, the Gestapo discovers the movement and puts an end to it, and Bonhoeffer is banned from any type of public speaking, including preaching. In October of 1940, Bonhoeffer begins work as a double agent for the German military intelligence, supposedly using his church contacts to help the cause of the Third Reich. In this role, he was able to travel to several European countries, and his travel to those countries allows Bonhoeffer to use his contacts in the church to pass on information about the resistance movement in Germany, which was relatively unknown outside of Germany. Bonhoeffer and his resistance peers hoped these efforts would gain support of the Allies, especially the Britons, for help in their efforts. But that support didn't happen. Understandably so, the British were skeptical. And they offered no resources, no support, or no promises of what would come of Germany if they were successful in assassinating Hitler. Nonetheless, Bonhoeffer and his co-conspirators were successful in helping many Jewish people to secretly escape from Germany. One such effort, called Operation 7, eventually led to the discovery of their work by the Gestapo. This leads to Bonhoeffer's arrest in April of 1943 and his imprisonment at the Tegel prison in Germany, in Berlin. By the way, if you'd like to see a piece of Tegel prison, come up to my office. I have a brick from that a former student secured for me on a visit there. Initially, the Gestapo treated it as a corruption case. They soon realized, however, that the rescue attempt was the tip of a larger iceberg. Bonhoeffer was charged with conspiring to rescue Jews, of using his travel abroad for non-intelligence matters, of misusing his intelligence position to keep the confessing church pastors out of the military, and for his own work on behalf of the church. And Bonhoeffer had a problem. Every one of those accusations was true. Still, even after a failed attempt by the conspirators to kill Hitler, if you've seen the movie Valkyrie, this is the failed attempt that they're referring to here. In the summer of 1944, it was months before the Nazis realized the extent of Bonhoeffer's involvement in the resistance movement. But eventually they did. And in October of 1944, Bonhoeffer is moved to a Gestapo prison outside of Berlin. In February of 1945, he is taken to another prison at Buchenwald. And eventually he's moved to Flossenburg, that I referred to before, the concentration camp, where on April 9th he was executed with several of his co-conspirators. 2 weeks later, on April 30th, 1945, Hitler commits suicide in his Berlin bunker. And a few days after that, May 2nd, Berlin falls, and on May 7th, the German army is forced into an unconditional surrender. So that's the capsule of the life of Bonhoeffer. So many things in there that I left out, and forgive me for you Bonhoeffer scholars that may know these things, but it sets up where I want to go now. And that is, what is our response? Why do we care? What do we learn from somebody that makes this kind of decisions, these kind of sacrifices, and has this kind of influence on the world even today? So as I promised in my title, I want to close this presentation by answering the question, so what? In doing so, I think that brings us full circle to our world today, and to the lessons that we can take from these 3 lectures, these 3 days here in chapel, and our production of Remember My Name. In Bonhoeffer, we find one of the most aggressive voices in calling to all of us not to forget our responsibilities to the persecuted, to the oppressed, to those who, like in the case of the Holocaust, were intentionally and systematically discriminated against because of their nationality, the color of their skin, or their religious affiliation. God is a just God. His justice is perfect, and it's perfectly administered. But contrary to his justice is what happened in Germany in probably one of the worst injustices the world has ever known. And it's not only injustice, it is downright evil. And in the face of that injustice, in the face of that evil, Bonhoeffer calls the church to do something. And it's in that call that I want to conclude today. Bonhoeffer's decision to join the resistance movement was a theological decision. His concern was the church and its place and its legacy amongst the German people. He was wrestling with this theological quagmire. As he was wrestling with it, he produced a document entitled The Church and the Jewish Question. And this essay brought clarity and challenge to the church. And he originally presented it actually in April of 1933, about 12 years before he was executed. And in it, Bonhoeffer seeks to address the problem the church faced under this new Nazi dictatorship. In the speech, Bonhoeffer begins by emphasizing that the church has, here's a quote, the church has to affirm the state as God's order of preservation. Romans 13:1. God has given us government to preserve order. He emphasizes that government exists from God, and it's to preserve order in the world, and they are accountable to God for that task. This doesn't mean, however, that the church is indifferent about the actions of the state. So Bonhoeffer would write, there we go. Sorry, I keep getting ahead of myself. Instead, the church can and must keep asking the government whether its actions can be justified as legitimate state actions. That is, actions that create law and order, not actions of rights and disorder. In doing so, the church will, of course, see the state limited in 2 ways. Either too little law and order or too much law and order compel the church to speak. So Bonhoeffer is very clear about what constitutes too little law and order. It comes about whenever a group of people is deprived of its rights. Any state that deprives people of their legal rights is acting in a lawless manner and thus loses its legitimacy and divinely appointed authority. Bonhoeffer was also clear about what constitutes too much law and order. This comes about when the state interferes with the affairs of the church and uses its force to rob the Christian faith of its right to proclaim the gospel message. The Third Reich, of course, was doing both. He argues that the church had three actions it could take in situations like these, in which the state was preserving too little law or in order in society, or yielding too much power in law and order by interfering with the affairs of the church. Three things. Number one, he says the church has the responsibility to hold the state accountable. The first action was for the church to question the state as to the legitimate character of its actions. That is, making the state responsible for what it does. The second responsibility the church had is to care for the victims. Regardless of whether the state responded to the church's questions and changed its actions, Bonhoeffer argued that the second action the church should take is to engage in service to the victims of the state actions, because the church has an unconditional obligation towards the victims of any societal order, even if those victims do not belong to the Christian community. Bonhoeffer argued that the followers of Christ have an obligation to all who suffer, whether they confess Christ's name or not. And I believe that is the point of the story of the Good Samaritan. But then he offers a third action, and that is to fight. And this is the controversial part of what he says. Bonhoeffer saved his most radical contention for the last. The first was to fight, was to question and call the state to responsibility. The second was to help the victims of injustice. The third possibility is not just to bind the wounds of the victim beneath the wheel. Ultimately, in his words, the church might find itself called to fall into or to jam into the spokes of the wheel itself in order to halt the machinery of injustice. What Bonhoeffer was proposing was scandalous to the German church. His remarks were not fuzzy, and to take them seriously would be a risk to their lives, which is precisely what he eventually would do. Later on, he would use this illustration to make the point of what he was trying to say here. And he used the illustration of a guy or somebody driving down a crowded street, and purposely doing everything they could to swerve and run over and run into people to kill them. And so his question was, what is our responsibility? If we can stop the driver of that car, we do it, including killing them. And that's hard for us to hear, I get that. But in the most radical situations, that may be the action that a person is called to. Now, in this, let me help you understand. Bonhoeffer is not saying that the church should take up guns and go out and do things. But what he is saying is we as individuals may have a responsibility to take action. Unfortunately, liberation theology has distorted this truth and has become too cavalier in its application of this construct. If you go into Latin America, you can see all kinds of things about how the church has distorted it there. But Bonhoeffer himself would not act on his own conclusions of these questions until his final decision in 1938 to not just support, but to join the resistance movement. So to bring this to a conclusion, I'm going to quote from Victoria Barnett of the International Bonhoeffer Society, where she writes, "Who is Dietrich Bonhoeffer? In December of 1942, Bonhoeffer sent a Christmas letter from prison to his family, and it's labeled 10 years after. And he wondered whether this decision to return to Germany and to work in military intelligence had been the right one. He says, are we still of any use? He pondered the different motives for fighting evil, and noticing that even the finest intentions could prove insufficient. And he asked, who stands firm? Well, he writes, he says, only the one for whom the final standard is not his reason, not his principles, not his conscience, not his freedom, not his virtue, but who is ready to sacrifice all these things when in faith and sole allegiance to God He is called to obedience and to responsible action. The responsible person is the one whom life will be nothing but an answer to God's questions and call. She goes on and says, in this letter, the various threads of Bonhoeffer's life and work come together. He had been one of the few in this church to demand protection for the persecuted as a necessary theological and political step. He had called upon his church, traditionally aligned with the state, to confront the consequences of that allegiance. He tried to determine what kind of Christian faith was viable in his world. As hardly any other Christian thinker in history, Bonhoeffer articulated a theology that truly confronted his times. He did not do so with the benefit of hindsight that we have today, but he did so in the middle of the Third Reich and its activities itself. And we're left with many questions about where his life could have led, but in a very real sense, the questions that Bonhoeffer left unresolved are the ones we still face today as we continue to wrestle with the injustices of this world. So in conclusion, you know we live in a world, we live in a country where these injustices are still very much a part of our lives. Genocide happens. I read something the other day. There's religious persecution going on in the world that we live in right now. There's abuse of citizenry by governments. Abortion. There's systematic poverty, sometimes fueled by misgovernments. I've seen that firsthand in the country of Haiti. And of course, we know that the racial injustices and prejudice have not been eliminated in the world that we live in. Sex trafficking is a huge issue in our society. And how about the sexual abuse of children by authority figures whom they trusted, including this happening in the church? The world is not rid of injustice. How are we to respond? So I propose to you, this is why we should care. As current and future influencers and leaders in the church, I challenge you to consider my friend's call and example of how to respond. Taking a bit of liberty and using Bonhoeffer's template, I ask you to ask yourself about the injustices that you may know of. 1. Think of that injustice. Is this a place where I need to hold the state or authorities involved, even church authorities, accountable? We are not given permission to say nothing. And Bonhoeffer famously said, to do nothing is to do something. Number 2, what can and should I be doing for those victims? Who needs a Band-Aid that I can apply? And number 3, where do I need to become a spoke in the wheel, so to speak, of this injustice? That is, what can I do to help stop it? Where do you hear the modern victim calling out to you? Remember my name. Maybe, just maybe, that's God speaking through them, calling you, calling me to action. Thank you. You are dismissed.